The thermometer outside read -40 degrees in 3 miles northeast of the Harlan Driscoll homestead, where the wealthiest man in the settlement was feeding his dining table leg by leg into a fireplace that still couldn't push the indoor temperature. Past 45, a woman sat in her shirt sleeves reading by firelight. The stone at her back breathed warmth, the way living things breathe steadily, without effort, without end. The thermometer on her wall read 62. She turned a page. This is where the story ends. It begins 18 months earlier in grief so specific, it had a texture, the grain of pine logs that had killed her family one cold degree at a time. Nora Vass had come to Dakota Territory in 1875 with her husband Thomas and the particular confidence of people who had survived hard things before. They came from Ohio by way of Pennsylvania, carrying between them the accumulated knowledge of how to work Thomas with his hands, Nora with her mind. She had kept books for a coal mining operation outside of Pittsburgh for 3 years before they married, sitting in lamplight, recording numbers that translated into other people's lives: tons extracted, wages, paid timber, consumed per shaft, fatality rates per 100 men. She had learned to read systems. She had learned that numbers told the truth when people preferred not to. Thomas was a builder by instinct, if not by formal training. He notched logs with the care of someone who understood that shelter was not a luxury in this country. He studied the cabins other settlers had raised, asked questions at the general store, listened to the older homesteaders who had been through Dakota winters before. He chinked gaps with moss and clay. He oriented the door away from the prevailing northwest wind. He stacked firewood in quantities that seemed excessive to newcomers and necessary to anyone who had lived through February. Their daughter Lily was born in 1876 in the cabin Thomas had built during their first summer on the land. She came into the world small and vocal, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's tendency toward absolute conviction on subjects she'd barely considered. By the time she was 4, she had opinions about the correct way to store apples through winter. By 5, she could identify bird calls with the focused attention of a child who had grown up with silence worth listening to. By 7, she was the kind of person who asked questions that adults deflected because they didn't have good answers. The winters of 1878 and 1879 were cold by any standard Nora had carried from Ohio, but they were manageable. The cabin held. The firewood lasted. The family moved through each season with the rhythmic labor that frontier life required, and Nora kept her notebook's temperatures in the morning wood, consumed per week, Lily's growth measurements marked in pencil on the doorframe. She wrote these things not from sentimentality, but from the habit of a woman who believed that patterns revealed themselves to whoever bothered to look. She noticed things she always had. She noticed that the north-facing corner of the cabin was always colder than the others, that the gap between the second and third log from the floor seemed to widen each autumn as the wood dried and contracted. That heat from the fireplace climbed straight to the ceiling, where it vanished through inadequate insulation without ever warming the sleeping corner where Lily's bed stood. She mentioned these observations to Thomas, who addressed them one by one: more chinking, better bark on the roof, a wool curtain to separate the sleeping space. He was a thorough man. He took her observations seriously. The cabin improved each year in small increments that felt in 1879 like they were approaching something sufficient. They were not approaching sufficient. They were approaching 1880. December of that year arrived with a quality that was different from cold Nora had experienced before. Previous cold had been an absence, the warmth of summer simply gone replaced by its opposite. This cold was a presence. It pressed against the cabin walls with intention. It found every gap Thomas had chinked and reopened it. The wood contracted in temperatures that dropped past -20 degrees and stayed there through Christmas, through the New Year, through the first week of January without relief. Thomas burned wood the way a man bails a flooding boat, continuously, desperately, without the luxury of believing the effort is winning. He had stacked what seemed an impossible amount of firewood the previous autumn, more than their most experienced neighbors, more than the old-timers suggested, and he watched it diminish at a rate that made his jaw tight every morning when he opened the door to retrieve the next armload. Nora kept recording. -22, -26. 6 logs per day, then 8, then 10 as the month progressed, and the gap between what the fireplace produced and what the walls surrendered grew wider despite everything they threw at it. Lily slept in 4 layers of blankets with her wool hat pulled down over her ears, positioned as close to the fireplace as safety allowed, and her breath still made frost clouds in the air above her face. Nora would lie awake watching those small clouds materialize and dissolve, counting them the way she counted everything, the way her mind refused to stop even when she wanted it to. She understood in those sleepless hours that she was watching a system fail. Not through neglect or incompetence, Thomas had done everything right by every measure anyone in this territory had ever applied. He had followed the rules exactly. The rules were simply wrong. She did not say this to him. He was already carrying the failure as a physical weight she could see in his shoulders every time he came back in from the woodpile, the cold pouring off his coat in waves that reached her across the room. He knew something was wrong. He did not need her to give it a name. On the morning of January 15th, the temperature dropped to -38. Thomas stood at the door before dawn, looking at the thermometer nailed to the exterior wall. The mercury pulled down into ranges the instrument seemed reluctant to report. He stood there long enough that Nora crossed to him, put her hand on his arm through his coat sleeve. His voice was flat in the specific way of a man working to keep it that way. "It's not going to break this week." She knew he was right. She had watched the sky the previous evening, the clouds moving in formations that experienced settlers recognized. This was not a temporary cold snap. This was the winter deciding what it was. They managed the days by degrees. Nora read to Lily in the warmest corner, with the child pressed against her side, generating shared body heat with the pragmatic unself-consciousness of people past caring about comfort and thinking only about survival. Thomas fed the fire with the mechanical focus of someone whose only remaining job was to keep that particular thing burning. He did not speak much. When he spoke, it was practical. The wood in the south pile was burning faster than the north pile logs. They should switch. The gap above the door frame had opened again. He needed rags to plug it. The horse needed checking. The night of January 17th, the temperature fell to -44 degrees. Thomas went out for wood at 8 o'clock, the usual hour, with the usual lantern and the usual coat and the usual boots that had served him through 2 previous winters. He went 20 feet to the woodpile. Nora was reading at the table when she became aware without consciously marking the exact moment that too much time had passed. She did not count the minutes. She knew the way you know when a clock has stopped, not by noticing the absence of sound, but by noticing the quality of the silence that replaces it. She opened the door. He was face down in the snow between the woodpile and the cabin door. One arm outstretched, his hand still closed around 2 logs he had gathered before his legs quit. The lantern had fallen, but not gone out. It lay on its side 2 feet from his body, casting orange light across the snow, in a shape that looked like nothing that had any right to exist. She knelt in the snow in her socks and turned him over. His face was the wrong color. She pulled him toward the cabin door with a strength that did not feel like hers and belonged to some other woman who lived in emergencies rather than visiting them. She got him inside. She worked on him for an hour. She already knew in the part of her mind that never stopped counting and measuring and reading patterns that he had been outside too long in -44 degrees, while already exhausted from weeks of fighting a failing system, and that the cold had taken the opportunity she had inadvertently given it. Thomas Vass died that night. Not from one catastrophic cold, from 1,000 small failures of insulation, from gaps that should not have existed, from a building method that everyone accepted as sufficient and was not. The cold had found him because the cabin had been letting it in all winter, degree by degree, wearing him down until the final trip to the woodpile was one trip too many. Nora sat with him until first light, and then she went to Lily. Lily had slept through it mercifully, the sleep of a child who was burning too many calories staying warm and whose body had decided on conservation. She woke to find her mother sitting at the edge of her pallet with an expression Lily had never seen on that particular face, and Lily Vass, who was 7 years old and asked questions that adults couldn't answer, looked at her mother for a long moment before she asked anything at all. They were alone for 4 days before a neighbor came to check on them. During those 4 days, the temperature did not rise above -32. Nora burned the table methodically, breaking it into pieces with the axe and feeding them into the fireplace with the focused calm of a woman who has moved past grief into something more functional and more terrible. She burned the chairs. She considered the bookshelves and decided against them. The wood was thin and dry and would burn fast, and she needed pieces she could ration. She fed Lily everything warm she could produce on a fire she kept going with furniture and determination. The second night, Lily woke in the dark hours when the cold was deepest. She pressed herself into her mother's side for warmth, and lay quiet for a while in the way that meant she was thinking through something carefully before committing to words. Then, without preamble, in the simple declarative voice of a child who hasn't yet learned to soften inconvenient questions. "Mama, why don't we live in the ground like bears? Bears never get cold in winter." Nora did not answer. She held her daughter tighter and looked at the fire and thought about bears who had solved this problem before humans thought to try building wooden boxes against the sky and calling them sufficient. She thought about the coal mines she had recorded numbers for in Pittsburgh, the way the miners came up from shifts in January, still sweating from the warmth of the earth, the way the temperature in the shafts stayed constant no matter what winter was doing to the surface. She had written those numbers in her ledgers without understanding what they meant. She understood now. She did not say any of this. She said nothing. But she grasped Lily's question and held it the way she had held the logs Thomas cut, not as a question to answer in the moment, but as a tool to carry and use later. Lily died on the morning of January 21st, her small body finally unable to maintain its warmth against the accumulated exposure of weeks in an inadequately heated space. She went quietly in her sleep, which was the one mercy available. Nora held her daughter for 6 hours after that, sitting in the corner nearest the fire, not willing to be pragmatic about this particular thing, yet not for 6 hours. When the neighbors came, the Adler family, who had been worried enough about the silence from the vast homestead to make the cold half-mile trip, they found Nora composed in the specific way that means a person has gone somewhere inside themselves temporarily and will return when they are ready. She thanked them for coming. She accepted their presence without asking for it. She arranged for Thomas and Lily to be buried when the ground permitted it, which would not be until March. She did not leave the cabin. The remaining weeks of that winter she spent in a state that looked from the outside like grief, which it was layered over something else that was harder to name and more dangerous to the established order of things. It was rage, but not the formless kind that needs expression. It was the precise, focused rage of a woman who has watched a system fail and understands exactly how and why, and is not willing to simply accept the failure as the price of living in a cold place. She looked at the cabin walls, Thomas's work, good work, work that followed every rule anyone had ever articulated, and she felt the cold still seeping through, less deadly, now that the worst of the winter was breaking, but present. Demonstrable. The grained texture of the logs against the light held a particular condemnation. Wood. Always wood. Log cabins had sheltered people on this frontier for generations, and they had always been cold, had always consumed wood, at rates that kept people perpetually anxious about whether their supply would hold, had always created the same losing battle between the heat a fire could generate and the temperature a poorly insulated shell allowed to escape. And nobody, as far as Nora could determine, had ever stood back and asked whether there was a better way. They had simply built the same insufficient thing over and over and accepted the casualties as the weather's fault rather than their own design's failure. She was a woman who kept ledgers. She knew whose fault it was. Spring came late in 1881, snow retreating slowly from a landscape that looked exhausted, which it was. The settlement gathered to bury Thomas and Lily on a hillside where the ground had finally softened enough to accept them. Reverend Aldous Hale spoke with genuine feeling, a decent man doing his best with theology in the face of specific mechanical failure. Harlan Driscoll attended, which surprised no one. He attended everything in the settlement, partly from community spirit and partly because a man who owned more acres than anyone else in the county understood that his position required visibility. He expressed condolences to Nora with the particular gentleness of powerful men toward women they have already categorized as needing management. After the burial, before the small gathering had fully dispersed, Harlan Driscoll drew Reverend Hale aside in the way men draw other men aside when they have decided something on behalf of someone who hasn't been consulted. They came to Nora together, which was itself a statement about how they understood the conversation they were initiating. Harlan's offer was generous and condescending in equal measure. A room in his home for the remainder of the difficult spring, practical assistance in whatever decisions needed to be made about the vast property, the weight of his experience and resources available to a woman who was, after all, alone now. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who understood the world in a particular way and was offering the best version of that understanding. The best version happened to require her to become someone who needed what he was offering. Nora looked at him steadily. "Thank you, Harlan. I'll be staying at my place." The silence that followed had texture. Harlan was not accustomed to the word no from any direction, but especially not in this register, quiet without apology, without the softening that would have made the refusal easier to file away as confusion or grief speaking. Reverend Hale watched his face with the careful attention of a man who had witnessed enough of human nature to recognize when something significant had just occurred. She walked back to the cabin that had killed her family, and she started writing in her notebook. What she wrote was not grief, though grief was the fuel. She wrote observations about the cabin's failure, systematic and specific. The rate of heat loss per log burn, the temperature differential between the fireplace corner and the sleeping corner, the behavior of gaps as wood dried and contracted across seasons. She wrote about the coal mines in Pennsylvania and what she remembered from the records she'd kept, the constant temperatures in the shafts, the notation she'd made once in the margins of a quarterly report: miners remove coats at 60 feet regardless of surface conditions. She had not known then what she was recording. She knew now. She wrote a letter to the Territorial Library in Yankton requesting any available material on the geology of Dakota Territory, with particular interest in limestone formations and their thermal properties. She sent it with the next mail rider. Then she waited, and while she waited, she talked to old Walt Beckett. Walt Beckett was 65, a former coal miner who had worked shafts in Pennsylvania for over 2 decades before his back gave out, and he came west for reasons he didn't discuss with people who hadn't earned the conversation. He lived at the edge of the settlement in a small cabin that he had built with the specific priorities of a man who understood cold from the inside of the earth, outward low, deeply insulated, oriented exactly right. He was not a sociable man, but he was not an unkind one. He answered questions honestly, which was a rarer quality than it sounded. Nora found him splitting wood behind his place on a morning in late April, working with the efficient rhythm of someone who had performed this particular motion 10,000 times. She did not waste his time with preamble. She told him what she was thinking about the temperature in mine shafts at depth, the behavior of rock versus wood as thermal materials, the idea she was beginning to construct about whether the earth itself could be used as a component of shelter, rather than simply as the ground you built above. He set down his axe and looked at her for a moment. Most people who had theories about building in his experience were looking for agreement. This woman was looking for correction. He could tell the difference. What followed was the most useful conversation Nora had in the year after Thomas and Lily died. Walt explained thermal mass with the precision of someone who had lived its consequences rather than learned them from books. Rock-absorbed heat slowly held it long, released it at a rate that smoothed out the wild swings of surface temperature. The earth at depth below the frost line connected to the geological stability that didn't know or care about Dakota winters, maintained temperatures between 50 and 55 degrees in this region, regardless of what was happening at the surface. A fire burning for 2 hours in a stone-backed space could warm that stone enough to radiate heat for 8 hours afterward. Wood couldn't do this. Wood heated fast and cooled fast and transmitted outside temperatures inward through its grain. It was the wrong material for a place where the difference between surface temperature and survival temperature was 60 degrees. He said it simply without drama. Wood fights the cold and loses. Rock doesn't fight. It just exists. Nora wrote it down verbatim. She underlined it 3 times. She recognized the sentence the way you recognize something you already knew but had not yet found the words for. She told him what she was planning. Not the finished version. She didn't have a finished version yet, but the shape of it. A structure integrated into a limestone formation using the rock face as the primary thermal mass rather than as an obstacle to be built away from. The earth doing the work that wooden walls failed at. Walt was quiet for a while in the way of men thinking rather than men about to speak. Then the physics are right. Another pause. But I want you to understand something about what you're proposing, Mrs. Voss. They won't just laugh at you. They'll explain to each other that grief has done something to your reasoning. A widow who refuses the help that's offered lives alone and then builds herself a cave in a rock face that's not a story this settlement will tell kindly. Nora looked at him without flinching. Thomas built our cabin exactly the way everyone said to build it. He followed every rule this settlement considers proven. She paused. You know what happened. Walt picked up his axe. He did not argue the point. The library book arrived in early May, a slender geological survey of the Northern Territories, dense with technical language that Nora read with the focused attention she had once given to ledgers. She extracted what she needed: limestone's thermal properties, its stability under freeze-thaw cycling, its behavior with moisture. She found what she was looking for in several things she hadn't expected to look for, which was always the sign of a useful source. She borrowed Dr. Emmett Pruitt's thermometer with a brief explanation that she was conducting temperature measurements and would return the instrument with full documentation of her readings. Pruitt was a practical man with the empirical inclinations of someone who had chosen medicine in an era when medicine was mostly careful observation. He handed over the thermometer without conditions. She rode northeast for 2 days alone with the thermometer wrapped in cloth in her saddlebag, and her notebook in her coat pocket, and the rifle across her saddle that she had learned to use in her first year on the frontier. She was not looking for farmland. She was not looking for water, though she noted the small spring when she found it. She was looking for limestone. She found it on the third day out, a bluff rising 25 feet from the prairie, its face weathered into the horizontal layers that Walt had told her to look for. At the base, erosion had carved a recess, not a cave, but a deep alcove, perhaps 11 feet deep and 16 feet wide, the overhang solid above it, the floor inside dry despite recent rains. The face pointed southeast. She dismounted and approached slowly, stepped into the alcove. The temperature change was immediate and physical, the kind of difference you feel before you measure it. Outside, the May afternoon was 68 degrees. She hung the thermometer on a projection of rock and waited 30 minutes, then read it 59 degrees. 9 degrees of difference with no fire, no insulation, no construction. Just rock and its relationship with the earth below it. She pressed her palm flat against the limestone, cool and dry, absolutely steady. She pressed harder as if she could read something through the contact, and perhaps she could. The stone communicated something that the wood of her cabin had never managed. Not warmth, not exactly. Steadiness. The geological conviction of something that had been here before this territory was a territory before the country was a country, before the first human being looked at a Dakota winter and tried to figure out how to survive it. She stayed 3 days. She checked the thermometer every 2 hours and recorded every reading in the notebook. Outside temperature 46 to 72 degrees over the 3 days, a swing of 26 degrees. Inside the alcove 51 to 54 degrees, a swing of 3 degrees. Against the rock face directly 52 to 53 degrees, barely 1 degree of variation across 3 full days of surface temperature, ranging from near freezing nights to warm afternoons. The earth was doing what wood could not. It was simply being what it was, absorbing the extremes and returning steadiness. She sat in the alcove on the evening of the third day and watched the sun go down over the prairie, and thought about Lily asking why they didn't live in the ground like bears, and she thought that the bears had been practicing the right answer for a very long time before anyone thought to ask them about it. She rode back to the settlement and told Walt what she had found. He came out to see it because he was a man who trusted measurements, but trusted his own eyes more. He spent an hour examining the formation, striking the overhang with a hammer, and listening to the sound quality that indicated structural integrity, running his fingers along the horizontal layers, checking for stress fractures, studying the drainage pattern standing inside the alcove, and performing the particular mental calculations of someone who has spent decades in underground spaces evaluating rock. He checked Nora's temperature records against his own reading and nodded once. The formation was sound, the site was ideal. The physics would work exactly as they had discussed. He confirmed it with the specific brevity of an honest man who only uses as many words as the situation requires. Then he told her again, more specifically this time, what she was going to face from the community. Not because he thought she hadn't understood the first time he knew she had, but because the particular form the social pressure would take mattered, and she should know its shape before she stood in front of it. She had heard him. She called the community meeting for the last Sunday of May. Settlement meetings at the Garrett Barn happened, monthly benches arranged in the cleared space. The business of shared infrastructure and mutual defense and collective decision-making, conducted with the democratic bluntness of people who couldn't afford to waste an afternoon on performance. Nora had not attended since the burial. Her return was noted by every person in the room before she sat down. She waited until the ordinary business concluded: road maintenance on the east track, a dispute about property boundaries near the creek, the question of the communal bull's schedule, and then she stood. She described what she had found. She described what she intended to build. She used the word thermal mass and explained it in 3 sentences, and she showed Walt's thermometer in her recorded readings, and she described the limestone formation in its position, in its structural soundness, in the drainage pattern, in the southeastern orientation that would capture winter sun at a low angle, while the overhang would shade the entrance in summer. She was clear and specific, and she did not apologize for any of it. The silence afterward lasted perhaps 8 seconds. Harlan Driscoll laughed first, which was not surprising. He was a large man who filled space comfortably accustomed to the room calibrating itself around his responses. The laugh was not cruel in the way of a man who enjoys cruelty. It was the laugh of someone whose understanding of the world has just been bumped by something it cannot immediately process, and who defaults to dismissal rather than confusion. Others joined in the nervous laughter of people who were genuinely uncertain what the correct response was, but were grateful that Harlan had provided one. Owen Garrett, who was the settlement's finest carpenter, and knew it raised the technical objections in the measured voice of professional certainty. Rock faces were not structurally stable in the way that people unfamiliar with construction tended to assume. The overhang could fail under snow load. Moisture would seep from the limestone, continuously creating conditions that would rot any wood in contact with it within 2 seasons. The natural fissure she was proposing to use as a chimney would not draw properly. The physics of ventilation in geological formations were not equivalent to engineered chimney systems. The project was not merely unusual, it was dangerous, and its failure was a matter of when, not whether. Reverend Hale did not cite scripture this time. He was too experienced with grief to make that mistake again. He was also in his way genuinely concerned, not dismissive, but frightened for her, which was its own form of condescension. His voice was gentle with what he believed was compassion. Nora, no one in this room doubts your courage, but there are limits to what a woman alone ought to attempt. That's not a judgment, it's a concern from people who care about you. She looked at Reverend Hale. She had known him for 6 years, had listened to his sermons through 2 winters that killed nobody and one that killed her entire family. And she recognized that he meant well with a completeness that made his meaning worse. He was telling her that her plan was beyond what someone like her should attempt. Someone like her. A widow. Alone. The room waited. Walt Beckett, from this back row where he had positioned himself with the deliberate quiet of a man who rarely spoke at community gatherings and wanted to choose his moment, said, "The physics are correct. I worked underground for 22 years. What she's describing will work." He said nothing else and sat back. The effect of that endorsement was partial, which Nora had expected. Walt was respected for his practical knowledge, but had the social standing of a man who lived at the edge of things by choice. His backing meant something without meaning enough to turn the room. Harlan Driscoll looked at Nora with the expression of a man recalibrating, not changing his position, but adjusting the category into which he was placing her. He had read her initial refusal of his offer as grief making her irrational. He was beginning to read it as something else, which was less comfortable. "It's a free territory," he said in the tone of someone granting permission they know they have no authority to grant. "Nobody's stopping you." What he meant was, nobody will help you either. Nobody will step forward and associate themselves with this plan, which is going to fail publicly and expensively. Nobody will risk their own standing to carry your idea. You will do this alone, and when it fails, you will have done that alone too. Nora was already standing to leave. She had what she came for, which was not permission and not support. She had given the community the information they needed to understand what was happening 2 miles northeast of them. Whether they chose to use that information was their own affair. Outside the barn, the prairie stretched away in every direction under a sky still wide and blue with late May. She had measurements. She had a site. She had Walt Beckett's confirmation and Dr. Pruitt's thermometer and a notebook full of data in the specific burning memory of a child asking why they didn't live in the earth like bears. She had everything she needed. She had 14 holes to drill into solid limestone. She went home and made a list of supplies. The first hole took all of June 3rd. Nora started before the sun cleared the bluff when the limestone face was still in shadow, and the morning air carried the particular coolness of the alcove that she was beginning to understand as a promise rather than a coincidence. She had positioned her first anchor point at shoulder height on the rock face 8 inches to the right of where the natural fissure ran upward through the stone. She placed the iron chisel against the marked spot, raised the sledgehammer with both hands, drove it down. The chisel bit a 1/4 inch into the limestone. Rock dust fine as flour drifted onto her boots. She hit it again. Again. The sound rang off the alcove walls and bounced back at her in a way that felt in those first hours almost companionable. Sharp metallic impact, followed by the flatter resonance of iron on stone. By the time the sun had moved enough to light the interior of the alcove directly, she had a depression, perhaps an inch deep. Her hands were already burning. She kept going. The rhythm she found was not the rhythm of someone accustomed to this kind of labor. It was the rhythm of someone teaching herself to be, which is a different thing. Halting at first, the adjustments constant, the sledgehammer finding angles that wasted force before she learned to drop it in the precise arc that transferred the most weight into the least recovery. She took breaks when her grip failed, sitting on the limestone floor with her back against the cool rock face, shaking her hands out, watching the dust settle. She drank from the canteen she'd brought. She did not let herself look at the hole too often, because a hole measured in quarter inches was not a hole yet. By midday, she had 2 inches. By late afternoon, 4. By the time the light dropped below the level of usefulness, she had driven the hole to slightly past 5 inches, and both her palms were raw in the particular way that comes before blisters. The skin still intact, but the nerve endings announcing that this situation was not sustainable without intervention. She wrapped her hands in strips of cloth cut from an old shirt. She ate cold food sitting in the alcove entrance, watching the prairie darken, and she did the arithmetic she had been avoiding. 1 hole in 1 day, 5 inches, not 8. She needed 14 holes at 8 inches each. At her current rate, she was looking at 3 days per hole. 42 days just for the anchor points before she touched a single log. She recalculated, found the efficiencies she had missed. The way limestone fractured along its horizontal layers meant a chisel angled slightly downward could laver chips free rather than grinding through solid material. The following morning, she adjusted her technique, and the 2nd inch of depth on hole 1 came in half the time. The morning after that, she completed hole 1 to full depth, set the chisel tip, heard the subtle change in the hammer's resonance that told her she'd reached the mark. She moved to hole 2. The blisters formed under the calluses by the end of the first week, which was an anatomical fact she had not previously had occasion to discover. The outer layer of toughened skin protected nothing. The fluid simply accumulated beneath it, creating pressure that the callus then prevented from surfacing normally. She lanced them each evening with a needle wrapped. Her hands slept with her palms open to keep the cloth from adhering, and went back in the morning. The calluses hardened further. The blisters stopped forming. Her hands became, over the course of 2 weeks, something more like tools than like the hands she had arrived with. She completed hole 2 on the 3rd day, hole 3 on the 5th. By the 2nd week, working a full hole in a single long day had become possible, then reliable. The limestone was teaching her its grain, the way any material teaches a person willing to pay attention through failure first, then through the accumulating understanding of where it wants to split, where it resists, which angle of approach finds the path of least resistance, versus which one simply bounces force back up the handle into already damaged hands. Walt Beckett came on day 12. He arrived without announcement in the late morning, riding his mule at the deliberate pace of a man who had decided on a course of action and was not rushing it. He walked the alcove perimeter with his hands behind his back, stopped at each completed hole, measured depth with a marked stick. He produced from his coat pocket, ran a finger around the interior walls to check for the smooth taper that would hold mortar correctly. He took his time. He was a man who had inspected underground work for decades, who understood the difference between a job done to standard and a job done to the minimum that passes for standard, and who was not inclined to pretend he couldn't tell the difference. His verdict delivered while still looking at the holes rather than at Nora. "These are right. You're slower than a miner would be, but the work is correct." A pause. "I could help with the drilling." Nora mixed the next batch of mortar without looking up. "This is mine to build." Walt absorbed this without visible reaction, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He did not require her to explain herself. He understood the difference between stubbornness and the kind of ownership that a person builds into a structure when they need that structure to mean something beyond mere function. The cabin had to be hers in every inch, or it was just another thing someone else had built for her. He stayed 2 hours, answered 3 specific questions about mortar consistency, confirmed her approach to the iron pin placement, and rode back to the settlement. He returned twice more in July with the same quiet purposefulness, to observe, to answer questions she had accumulated since his last visit, to provide the specific endorsement of an expert witness without inserting himself into the process. It was a form of respect she had not expected from anyone that year. The drilling finished in late June. 14 holes 8 inches each positioned precisely according to the diagram she had redrawn 4 times in her notebook as her understanding of the structure's geometry refined itself. Her hands were permanently changed, rougher, stronger. The grip altered in ways she could feel when she did ordinary tasks like turning a door handle or writing in the ledger. She set the iron pins in mortar on June 28th, mixing the clay and lime with the care of someone who understands that this particular step is not reversible if you get it wrong. Each pin needed 3 days to cure before she could attach weight to it. She used that time to begin felling trees. She had selected the timber in May, walking the stands northeast of her property and marking the straightest pines with a notch of her hatchet trees of consistent diameter, without the spiral grain that made logs unpredictable when they dried. Now she dropped them one by one, limbed each trunk, cut the lengths she needed. She borrowed Walt's horse for the hauling which he had offered before she asked, loading the drag sled and making trips back to the alcove with the steady patience of someone who has converted a large project into a series of small, completable tasks. Owen Garrett came while she was debarking the 4th log. He arrived in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon without his tools, which told her this was an observation visit rather than a work visit. He stood at the alcove's edge and watched her pull the draw knife along the pine with the focused attention of a craftsman looking at someone else's technique, evaluating, filing the information in whatever interior catalog he maintained of how work was or wasn't being done properly. She kept working. The bark came away in long curling strips, pale wood underneath smelling of resin. His assessment came in the unhurried voice of someone who has thought it through before speaking. "I can build you a proper cabin, Nora. Oak framing double chinked better than what Thomas had. I'll give you a fair price." He paused. "Better than this." The offer was genuine in every dimension except the one that mattered, which was that it required her to stop. She understood that Owen Garrett did not experience himself as standing in her way. He was, from the inside of his own intentions, simply trying to help a widow avoid wasting her time on something that his expertise told him would fail. The fact that his expertise had not yet been tested against what she was building did not register as a gap in his position. He was a carpenter. He knew wood. This project was departing from wood, which placed it outside the boundaries of what he trusted. Nora set down the draw knife. She looked at him directly in the way she had learned over the course of a strange spring to look at people who were offering her the wrong thing with the right intentions. "When it works, Owen, come back and tell me what questions you have." He left without the gracious departures of a man who has made his offer and been graciously declined. He left with the particular discomfort of someone who has been answered rather than refused a different experience, harder to file under a familiar category. She watched him go, then picked up the draw knife. In town, the commentary about her project had settled into a genre. Not active mockery anymore, the community had moved past the entertainment phase into something more stable and more damaging, which was the consensus that poor Nora Vass had been broken by what happened in January and was building her brokenness into a rock face 2 miles from the settlement. People said it with compassion, which was worse than contempt, because it foreclosed the possibility of argument. You cannot argue with pity on its own terms. You can only build something that makes pity untenable. Miles Adler was 19 years old, the eldest child of a family that had arrived the previous year from Indiana, and he had the quality that the very young sometimes possess before the world has finished teaching them what is appropriate to be interested in. He had ridden out to the alcove twice in June, staying at a distance watching. The second time he'd been close enough for Nora to see his expression clearly, and what she saw was not pity, not the performed concern of the settlement adults, not even the curiosity of someone watching an oddity. It was the concentrated attention of a person encountering a problem and trying to understand it. He came back in the second week of July with his tools in his saddlebag. He did not ask. He dismounted, tied his horse, looked at the logs waiting to be moved, picked up the end of the nearest one, raised an eyebrow at Nora. She moved to the other end. They carried it together. He worked 3 days that week, 4 the next. He was strong in the uncomplicated way of young men who have done physical labor since they could lift things, and he learned quickly which mattered more. She explained the 6-inch gap between the log wall and the rock face once fully, because once was all it should need. If the explanation was complete, the limestone could weep condensation when temperatures shifted rapidly and direct contact between wet rock and wood created the rot that Owen Garrett had predicted as inevitable. The air channel she was building between stone and timber would allow natural convection to circulate, keeping both surfaces dry, letting the rock radiate its stored heat into the living space without ever touching the wood directly. The iron pins maintained the structural connection while preserving the gap. The geometry was exact because it had to be. Miles listened without interrupting, asked two clarifying questions, got his answers, and never raised the subject again. He had the gift of learning things without needing to demonstrate that he had learned them. His presence created a secondary problem that Nora had not specifically anticipated the settlement noticed. A young man spending his working days helping the widow who had refused Harlan Driscoll's offer and was building something the community had categorized as evidence of grief-induced instability. This generated the kind of attention that small communities generate effortlessly. Mrs. Adler made pointed remarks at the general store about her son's time and where it was being invested. Harlan Driscoll mentioned to Owen Garrett with studied casualness that Miles seemed to have found himself an unusual apprenticeship. Owen said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Miles came back the following Monday. Nora did not comment on whatever conversations had occurred in the intervening days because she had not asked him to come in the first place. He had made his own calculation. She respected it by not drawing attention to it. Then in the third week of July, Walt Beckett's back gave out. It happened the way these things happen at 65, not dramatically, not with a sudden catastrophic failure, but with the gradual increasing insistence of a body that has been performing beyond its structural tolerance for longer than it should have been. He sent word through Miles that he would be unable to visit the site for some weeks. Nora acknowledged the message, thanked Miles for delivering it, went back to work. The problem Walt's absence created was not emotional. It was technical, specific, immediate. She had been planning to ask him about the ventilation system during his next visit. The natural fissure in the limestone ran upward through the overhang at an angle she hadn't fully resolved, and she needed to understand exactly how to position the fireplace relative to it in order to create the draft that would pull combustion gases up and out, rather than allowing them to migrate down into the living space where carbon monoxide, heavier than the warm air that would be rising, would settle at breathing level. This was the kind of problem that killed people. Not eventually. Quickly. She spent 3 evenings alone in the alcove with a candle watching how the flame behaved. The fissure created a column of slightly lower pressure above it, and that pressure differential pulled air upward. She could see it in the way the candle flame bent toward the crack when she held it within 6 inches. She moved the candle to different positions, mapping the zone of influence, marking the points where the draft effect was strong enough to be reliable versus where it was marginal. She drew the results in her notebook with the precision of someone who understands that a margin of safety is not a margin you can assume. The fireplace needed to sit directly beneath the strongest pull point, not the most convenient construction location. She relocated her planned hearth position 18 inches to the left, which meant redoing the anchor calculations for that wall section. She did them. The night she finished, she sat at the relocated position with the candle and watched the flame bend toward the fissure with the clean certainty of air, following pressure differential. No ambiguity, no marginal cases. When Walt recovered and came out 3 weeks later, he inspected the hearth position, held his own candle in the same location she had mapped, watched the same flame behavior. His assessment was 3 words: better than planned. Nora understood that this was not modest praise from a man who didn't praise extravagantly. The walls rose through August with the slow momentum of a thing that cannot be rushed, but also cannot be stopped once it has begun. 4 logs high by the first week, 6 by the third, the structure taking a shape that bore no resemblance to any building the settlement had seen built before. From the northeast approaching along the creek trail, you would have seen it emerge from the rock face, the way geological formations sometimes suggest the shapes of things, as if the prairie had decided to attempt architecture on its own and had gotten partway through. Owen Garrett came back in the last week of August, this time with the specific purposefulness of a visit he had been building toward for some time. He examined the log-to-rock connections at length, probing the mortar around the iron pins, checking the levelness of the courses with his eye, and then with a plumb line he produced from his coat. He measured the 6-inch gap at 3 different points along the back wall without commenting on it. He looked at the chimney fissure and asked Nora to explain how she had positioned the hearth relative to the draft column, and she explained it, and he listened with the focused attention of a professional who has encountered a solution he had not previously considered. His objections when they came were fewer than before. He had come with 5 objections in May, and now arrived with perhaps 2, which was a kind of progress neither of them named. The moisture issue he maintained was still a concern. The gap might mitigate it in moderate conditions, but a severe winter could produce condensation rates that outpace the convective circulation. Nora walked him to the back wall where she had installed a narrow monitoring channel at the lowest point of the gap and showed him the small wooden indicator she checked weekly bone dry as it had been since she'd built it. He looked at it for a moment. Ruth Garrett, who was 8 years old and had been left at the alcove entrance with strict instructions to stay there while her father conducted his professional evaluation, had not stayed there. She had drifted inward the way children drift when they are told not to move in small increments that individually don't seem like violations of the instruction. By the time Owen finished his inspection of the chimney system, Ruth was standing with her palm flat against the limestone back wall, her face wearing the expression of a child who has discovered something that does not match what she expected. She turned to find her father watching her. "It's warm," her voice carrying the straightforward astonishment of someone who has been prepared for one experience and received another. "The rock is warm." Owen Garrett looked at his daughter's hand against the stone, looked at Nora, who had not engineered this demonstration and whose face showed it, looked back at the wall where his 8-year-old had just conducted the same basic experiment that Nora's temperature records documented in 43 days of measurements. He said nothing. He took Ruth's hand and walked her back toward his horse. But Nora, watching from the alcove, saw him pause at the edge of the rock overhang and look back once at the structure, not with the evaluating eye of a carpenter finding fault, but with the different expression of someone revising a conclusion they had held with confidence. He did not say anything to her on his way out. He didn't need to. The revision was visible on his face, and she had learned in a year of watching the community respond to things they didn't expect that visible revisions were more honest than anything that came out of people's mouths. September came with the first cold mornings of the new season, temperatures dropping into the 40s at night, the prairie shifting its colors toward the ochres that meant the long winter was loading itself somewhere north and would be arriving in due course. Nora completed the final structural elements in the 3rd week of the month. The door she had built from thick pine planks fitted with iron hardware from the settlement blacksmith sealed against the frame with a precision that represented several weeks of incremental adjustment. The window, a single pane of real glass she had spent more than she should have to acquire from a supply run to Yankton, set in a frame with interior shutters that closed with the tight confidence of something built to be closed completely. The roof was sod poles laid from the front wall back to the lip of the overhang, covered with split planks, then bark, then 6 inches of living earth that had already begun to bind itself together with the root systems of the grass she had seeded in August. Where the constructed roof met the limestone overhang, she had built the overlap. Walt had specified the geometry calculated so that water running down the rock face would pass over rather than under the edge. She had stood outside during 2 September rainstorms in the rain, watching the water's path to confirm the calculation was right. It was right. On September 29th, with the evening temperature at 48 degrees, she built the first fire. She used the kindling she had prepared in August: dry pine needles, birch bark, strips, small splits of the driest wood from the pile. She nursed the spark carefully with the attention of someone for whom fire had acquired a meaning beyond its function over the course of a winter that had required all of it to keep 2 people alive and had not been enough. The flame caught. She added larger pieces, progressively building toward a steady, moderate burn rather than the roaring fire her instincts wanted to make. The draft was immediate and clean. She had been afraid of this moment more than any other single moment in the construction. The ventilation either worked or it didn't, and if it didn't, she had built a carbon monoxide trap that would kill her quietly in the night. The smoke moved directly upward, entered the fissure, disappeared. No backdraft, no hesitation. The geological formation was doing what thousands of years of erosion had shaped it to do, moving air from ground level to atmosphere along the path of least resistance, pulling Nora's smoke along with it. She sat on the sleeping platform with Dr. Pruitt's thermometer in her hand and watched the needle move. 55 degrees after 20 minutes, 60 after 40, 65 after an hour. The air in the cabin was warm in the specific way that stone-radiated warmth differs from fire-radiated warmth without the fluctuation, without the directionality of heat coming from one source. The entire back wall was becoming a radiating surface, absorbing what the fire produced and beginning to return it as something steadier. She put her hand against the limestone at the fireplace end after 30 minutes warm. After an hour distinctly hot in the way of a surface that has taken on significant thermal load. This was the mechanism Walt had described in the abstract, and she was feeling it in the particular, the rock translating the fire's energy into something it could hold for hours after the fire itself was gone. She burned the fire for 2 hours, moderate and steady, using exactly the wood she had calculated. Then she extinguished it completely, not banked, not reduced, but out. She closed the chimney damper she had built into the fissure opening. She sat in the dark cabin with the thermometer and waited. 1 hour later, 63 degrees. The rock was releasing. 2 hours, still 61, still releasing. 3 hours after the fire's extinction, the interior temperature was 59 degrees, while the outside air had fallen to 42. A 17-degree differential maintained entirely by stone by density, by the principle that mass absorbs and returns energy at rates that have nothing to do with convenience and everything to do with physics. She did not celebrate. She sat with her back against the limestone wall that was still, even now, radiating warmth into the space around her at a rate she could feel against her shoulder blades, and she thought about Thomas going out for wood in the dark and the cold and not coming back. She thought about a child who asked the right question, too late to do any good. The tears that came were not grief in the acute form, not the way they had been in January. They were something that had reached the bottom of itself, which is a different thing, quieter without the quality of emergency. She sat in the warmth her rock face was making and let them come, and when they stopped, she stayed with her back against the stone and felt it breathing the way living things breathe. Walt Beckett came in early October to verify her temperature records with his own thermometer. He stayed 4 hours checking readings at intervals, making notes in his own small book. His numbers matched hers within a single degree at every measurement point. When he had finished, he looked at the cabin in a particular way, not the inspection look, not the evaluating look, but the look of someone encountering confirmation of something they believed but had not yet seen demonstrated at full scale. Dr. Emmett Pruitt arrived the following week on the stated errand of retrieving his thermometer. He spent 20 minutes inside the cabin with his own instrument, walking the perimeter, checking readings at different heights and positions, establishing the temperature profile of the space. He asked 2 questions about the draft behavior on high wind days, about moisture monitoring protocol, and received specific answers. He took the reading himself at 3.61 degrees interior, 39 degrees outside, 18 degrees of difference maintained on an October morning with no fire burning since the previous evening. He stood in the doorway for a moment before leaving the cold air behind him, the warm air of the cabin curling around him in visible tendrils. He looked at his thermometer, then back at the interior. Then he turned to Nora with the careful expression of a scientist who knows that a single data point is not a conclusion, but who also knows when a data point is significant. He set the thermometer on the shelf beside the door. "Keep it through the winter. I want a full season's documentation." Nora understood what he was offering. Not belief, not yet, he was too honest for premature conclusions. But investment. The thermometer staying meant Dr. Pruitt's professional attention was staying with it, which was a different quality of witness than any other she had acquired. December opened with cold in the familiar ranges, -15, -20. The temperatures that had been merely difficult before 1880 and had since acquired a different valence. Nora's routine settled into a pattern that bore no resemblance to the desperate arithmetic of her last winter in the log cabin. A fire in the evening, 2 hours, 4 logs. The rock absorbed it. A small fire in the morning to take the edge off another 2 logs at most. The rock gave back what it had taken steadily without drama through the night hours, when the outside temperature fell as low as -25, and the interior never dropped below 52. She kept meticulous records because she was constitutionally unable to do otherwise. Morning temperature without fire, 52 to 54 degrees. Post-fire peak, 67. Descent rate through the night, 2 to 3 degrees per hour on the coldest nights, slower when the rock had been well charged. Wood consumption, 3 to 4 logs per day, compared to the 10 to 12 she had burned in the log cabin's final weeks, to maintain temperatures 20 degrees colder than what she was keeping now. Miles Adler came by twice in December, not to work, but to see how it was holding up. He stood inside the cabin with the expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head, comparing what he was feeling against what the settlement consensus had predicted. He asked specific questions about the wood consumption numbers. She showed him the notebook. He read the entries carefully, 3 weeks of daily records, and handed it back without speaking about it, which was how she knew the numbers had registered at a level deeper than conversation. In the settlement, the smoke from her chimney, thin, intermittent against the constant heavy columns rising from every other structure, had become a subject of its own particular discussion. Some interpreted it as evidence that the structure wasn't producing enough heat to require serious firemaking, which confirmed their predictions of failure. Others, the ones who had burned through half their winter wood by December and were beginning the anxious calculations of whether what remained would last to March, looked at that thin smoke with an expression that had no good name yet, but would eventually become something like recognition. Harlan Driscoll did not look at it at all, or appeared not to. He had ordered an additional cord of wood hauled from 30 miles out at considerable expense after his supply consumption in November had run ahead of his most pessimistic projections. He was burning his way through winter with the resources of the settlement's wealthiest man, which meant he could afford to be wrong in ways that others could not. His wife Margaret, who had said nothing publicly about any of it, watched the thin smoke from Nora's chimney on the days it was visible from their kitchen window. The temperature on the night of January 4th dropped to -35, the lowest of the winter to that point, and Nora sat in her 59-degree cabin reading by the light of a single lamp, her back against the limestone that had been storing heat since her evening fire, 3 hours before the wall warm against her spine, like something alive, like something that had decided in its slow geological way to take a position on the question of whether she was going to survive this. Outside, the Dakota night was absolute. The stars were the particular bright of extreme cold, hard-edged. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like the land itself exhaling. Inside, the rock held its warmth, and the lamp held its light, and Nora Vass turned a page. The worst cold was still coming. She knew it had seen enough Dakota winters to understand the shape of the season, knew that January's opening was rarely its final word. What she felt reading in the warmth her limestone was making was not the invulnerability of someone who believed the worst was past. It was something quieter and more durable than that. It was the steadiness of someone who had built a thing correctly and knew it, who had done the work and checked the numbers and watched the data accumulate across 3 months into a pattern that no amount of community consensus could undo. The stone didn't care what Harlan Driscoll thought of it. It didn't care what Owen Garrett's professional assessment had been in May. It held its temperature at 59 degrees in -35, because that was what limestone connected to the Earth's deep constancy had always done, would do through every winter this territory could produce with or without anyone's approval. She turned another page. 18 days later, someone knocked on her door after dark. The knocking came again before she reached the door. Not the patient knock of someone who expected to be heard, but the urgent fisted rhythm of someone who had run out of patience somewhere on the 2-mile walk through -42 degrees of Dakota night. She opened the door. Harlan Driscoll stood in the darkness with his wife across his back. Margaret's arms hung limp over his shoulders. Her face turned sideways against his neck, the color of her skin in the lamplight, carrying the grayish pallor that Nora recognized from January of the previous year, with a recognition that moved through her body before it reached her mind. Harlan's own face showed the beginning stages of frostbite on both cheekbones, white patches against wind-reddened skin, the tissue beneath them already losing sensation. He had left his house without his outer coat. She could see that he had not planned this moment as far ahead as the coat. He did not speak. He was a man who had built his identity on the architecture of certainty, on always having the correct position and the resources to defend it, on never appearing at anyone's door in a condition of need. He had none of that available to him right now. He had his wife's weight across his back, 2 miles of -42 degrees behind him, frostbite starting on his face, and Nora Vass's open door in front of him. He looked at her. That was all. Nora stepped back. Bring her in. She had the sleeping platform cleared before he had Margaret fully through the door, moving with the efficiency of someone who has thought about this kind of emergency without allowing herself to consciously acknowledge that she was thinking about it. She directed him to the platform with a gesture, got Margaret horizontal, pulled the wool blankets from the storage chest. Margaret's hands were cold in the way that raised the distinction between cold and the beginning of something irreversible. She could feel it when she took them between her own palms, a temperature that was not just surface that had gotten into the tissue rather than merely sitting on it. She put the kettle on. She brought the blankets up around Margaret's shoulders, tucked them under her feet, with attention to the specific vulnerability of extremities. She checked the fissure damper still open from the evening fire, opened it, fully added 3 logs to rebuild the thermal charge that the open door had partially discharged. Then she went back to Harlan and told him to sit near the fire and not take his boots off yet. That sudden rewarming of frostbitten tissue required a sequence, not a rush. He sat. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, 60 degrees. He looked at the fireplace where 3 new logs were beginning to catch. He looked at his wife on the sleeping platform, with blankets around her and broth coming on the stove, and something happened to his face that a man with his habits of expression would not have permitted if he'd had the resources left to prevent it. Nora worked without speaking. This was not coldness. She had nothing punitive in her. Nothing that wanted Harlan Driscoll to experience his arrival here as humiliation. What she felt moving around the cabin with the focused competence of someone operating in their home territory was simpler than punishment. She was warm. Margaret was going to be warm. The limestone at her back was releasing the stored heat of 3 hours' fire into the space around all of them, steady, unglamorous, indifferent to the social history of everyone present. Margaret's shivering began 20 minutes after they brought her inside. This was the correct progression, the body recovering enough core temperature to initiate the warming process, the muscles finally able to do the work they had been too cold to attempt. Harlan watched it happen with the particular attention of a man who has been frightened past the point where his usual responses are available to him, stripped down to the single question of whether his wife was going to be all right. After an hour, Margaret could speak. Her voice was rough, but her eyes were tracking correctly, her color normalizing. She asked where she was, and Harlan told her, and she was quiet for a moment, taking that in. She looked at the ceiling, which was the underside of the sod roof's pole structure, warm and slightly irregular. She looked at the limestone wall. She looked at Nora. "Thank you." Her voice carrying the unembellished weight of someone saying a thing that contains more than its word count. Nora offered the sleeping platform for the night. Harlan protested in a way that had the form of refusal without the conviction, and she told him that Margaret needed consistent warmth through the remaining cold hours, that the journey back at -37 in the pre-dawn would accomplish nothing therapeutic. He accepted. She made up a pallet on the floor for herself, which he also protested, which she also ignored. She woke at 4 in the morning and checked the thermometer out of the habit she had built across 3 months of documentation, 54 degrees. No fire since midnight. The limestone had maintained 17 degrees above the outside temperature through the coldest hours of the night, purely on the thermal load it had absorbed before she slept. She added 2 logs more from discipline than necessity and went back to her pallet. By morning, the temperature outside had risen to -37, which felt almost mild against what the night had been. Harlan was awake before Nora, sitting near the rebuilt fire, with the stillness of someone who has been sitting in one place for a long time, with something to think about. Margaret was sleeping with the deep recovery sleep of a body that has been seriously stressed and is now repairing itself in warmth. He heard Nora rise. He looked at the thermometer, 58 degrees, before the morning fire had done more than take the edge off. He looked at the wood. She had used 4 logs for the previous evening's main fire, 2 overnight, 2 this morning. He was running his own arithmetic, comparing it against the cord he had brought in at extraordinary expense that was still depleting faster than his projections. He stood when he was ready to leave after Margaret had woken. Eaton demonstrated that she was genuinely recovered rather than merely functional. He helped her with her coat. He gathered his own things. He stood at the door for a moment with his hand on the frame, looking back at the interior, the stone wall, the gap at its base where the air channel ran the fissure above the hearth, the thermometer still reading 58 despite the open door already exchanging warmth for the cold outside. He opened his mouth, closed it. Then how much wood per day? 3 logs, sometimes 4. He absorbed this, gave one nod, the kind that means a calculation has completed. He walked out into the -37 morning with his wife on his arm, and Nora stood in the warm doorway watching them go until the cold forced her back inside. The news moved through the settlement by the mechanism that small communities have always used for moving important information, not announcement, not publication, but the specific velocity of something that people couldn't keep to themselves because it was too significant to sit on. Margaret Driscoll had collapsed from hypothermia in her own home on the coldest night of the winter. Harlan had carried her 2 miles to Nora Vass's rock cabin. She had recovered. By the afternoon of the following day, Owen Garrett appeared at Nora's door. His youngest daughter, Clara, was showing the early signs of frostbite on her toes. Not the emergency that Margaret had been, but serious enough that his own cabin's temperature fighting 40 below with everything it had was not adequate for recovery. He stood at the threshold with his daughter in his arms and the expression of a man who has been wrong about something important and has not yet found the words for it, but cannot afford to wait for them. Nora took Clara inside. The child sat near the fireplace with her feet unwrapped, the careful rewarming procedure applied sensation returning over the course of 2 hours, while Owen sat across the room and watched. He watched the thermometer. He watched the limestone wall. He watched his daughter's color improve in the specific way of a body receiving what it needed rather than what it could scrape together from inadequate sources. He asked questions this time with a different quality of attention than any previous visit. Not the evaluating skepticism of a craftsman looking for failure points, but the focused learning of someone who has decided to understand. How exactly was the iron pin seated relative to the log notch? What was the precise gap measurement at the base versus the top of the back wall? Had she experienced any variance in draft behavior between calm days versus high wind days? She answered everything. She showed him the notebook entries for wind days, 2 incidents where she'd monitored carefully both times the geological chimney performing without the downdraft problems that plague conventional stacks in high wind conditions, because the fissure's internal pressure dynamics were determined by the rock column above rather than by surface wind patterns. He read the entries himself in the same careful way Miles had read them in December, storing information rather than performing engagement with it. Before he gathered Clara to leave, Owen turned to Nora, and his voice carried the specific weight of a man keeping a commitment he'd made to himself before entering. "I told you it wouldn't hold. I was wrong about that." That was the only direct apology the cabin received from anyone it had confounded. It arrived in the understated register of frontier honesty, no elaborate accounting, no self-flagellation, just the straightforward acknowledgement of an error from a person whose professional judgment had been the error's vehicle. Nora received it in the same register without magnification, without the gracious performance of forgiveness that would have made it into something other than what it was. In the 2 weeks that followed, the cabin became what it had been built for, not just shelter for Nora, but the fact of warmth made available to whoever the winter had brought to the point of genuine need. Reverend Hale came on a Wednesday afternoon holding his hat rather than wearing it, his usual clerical authority replaced by the simpler posture of a son with a sick mother. His mother, 76 years old, had not been coherent in 3 days. The sustained cold inside the parsonage had gotten into her, the way cold gets into the very old, not all at once, but through the accumulated effect of breathing inadequately heated air for too many weeks. He asked with the careful syntax of a man unaccustomed to asking for anything, could she rest here for a few afternoons? She came every afternoon for 9 days. She arrived bundled past visibility, barely conscious of where she was. She left each evening alert enough to hold a conversation. On the 5th day, she recognized Nora specifically and asked for tea with the particular authority of a woman who has recovered enough to have preferences again. By the 9th day, she was sitting upright, telling Reverend Hale that he worried too much, the specific register of the recovered criticizing the concerned. The 3 Garrett children came next, Ruth among them, the same Ruth who had pressed her hand to the warm stone in August and announced her discovery with the authority of someone reporting a fact. They slept 2 nights on the floor near the limestone wall while Owen worked outside, desperately splitting frozen timber. They woke each morning having slept in conditions their own cabin hadn't managed since November. Ruth ran her hand along the wall each morning before breakfast, with the proprietary familiarity of someone acknowledging a thing they were the first to know. Dr. Pruitt came on the 4th day of the refuge period, not for warmth, but with his medical bag, moving between the various people who had sheltered in the cabin over preceding days, checking Margaret Driscoll's recovery progress, examining the elderly Mrs. Hale, documenting the reversals of hypothermia symptoms in his case notes with the systematic attention that had made him useful in this territory for 15 years. He cross-referenced his own temperature readings against Nora's documentation, extending the data set he had begun accumulating in October. He sat with her one evening after the others had gone in the warm quiet of the cabin, after the day's population had reduced back to 1, and told her what he intended to do with his observations. He was writing an account for a medical journal. Not a formal study. He was careful to say he didn't have the controlled conditions for formal study, but a documented case record of thermal management and its outcomes in extreme cold exposure. Nora Vass's structure would be the central reference. Her temperature records, which he had verified independently across 4 months, would provide the technical foundation. Her name would be in the record, not as a widow, not as a curiosity, not as the footnote to a tragedy, as the person who had built the thing that the records were about. She did not make a speech about this. She said she would provide him with the complete notebook. The cold broke in the third week of February, temperature rising to -10 on the 18th, then 0, then a remarkable 22 degrees by February 21st. That felt, after 6 weeks below 0, like something close to kindness. The crisis passed the way crises pass, not with a clean conclusion, but with the gradual withdrawal of the conditions that had made it a crisis. Families returning to their own spaces, the calculus of survival shifting back toward the normal management of ordinary difficulty. The settlement did not hold a meeting to discuss what had happened. There was no formal acknowledgement, no ceremony of revision. This was not evasion, it was the particular way that communities absorb corrections to their collective understanding, which is slowly, laterally through the accumulation of private recalibrations that eventually produce a changed consensus without anyone having to stand up and say the previous consensus was wrong. What change was observable in the specifics. The way people looked at Nora at the general store, no longer pity, no longer the careful compassion of managing someone fragile. A different register, more neutral, occasionally something close to respect, which felt, after 18 months of the alternative, almost startling. The way conversations paused when she entered the room, not from discomfort, but from the instinct of people who had learned that she was likely to say something worth hearing. Miles Adler came in March with a specific proposal. He had filed for homestead land 3 miles north of the settlement near a sandstone formation he had ridden out to assess after spending the winter, thinking about what he had helped build. He wanted Nora to look at the site. She rode out with him on a Thursday, spent 2 hours examining the formation's softer stone than limestone, lower thermal mass, different anchoring requirements, because sandstone's compressive strength varied more unpredictably. She explained the adjustments. She drew diagrams in her notebook and tore out the pages for him to keep. He started building in May with the pages in his coat pocket, making his own discoveries as he went, in the way of someone who has learned enough to learn the rest. She rode out twice to look at his progress, corrected one anchoring decision that would have created a moisture problem, confirmed that his ventilation approach was sound. When she left the second time, he was already back at work before she had mounted her horse, the focused absorption of someone who didn't need the teacher present anymore. Owen Garrett arrived on an April morning with a roll of paper under his arm, drawings for a cabin he was planning to build for his brother, who was homesteading land south of the territory. He spread the drawings on Nora's table and talked her through his design, which was his own synthesis, her thermal mass principles incorporated into a construction approach that used his carpentry skills rather than replacing them. He had developed a simplified anchoring method for harder limestone that reduced the drilling labor without compromising the connection strength. He explained it in the technical language of his trade, which she followed completely. She pointed out 2 things he had gotten right that he hadn't realized were improvements over her original design. He looked at those points for a while, recalculating. He rolled the drawings back up, said he'd return if questions arose, went back to his wagon. At the edge of the property, he stopped and looked back at the cabin the way he had in January, but with an entirely different expression, not revision this time, but something closer to the way craftsmen look at work they respect. The summer of 1883 brought Harlan Driscoll to Nora's door on a Tuesday afternoon, with drawings he had made himself rough, not a craftsman's work, but thought through. He had laid them on her table without preamble, and said in the specific voice of a man who has been thinking about how to say something for a long time, "My son is getting married. I want to build him a house that won't kill his family." There was no apology in those words. There was also no pretense that they didn't contain one. She helped him. She reviewed the drawings, identified 2 structural concerns, explained the correct approach to each. She answered his questions about sourcing iron pins, about the clay composition for mortar in the specific soil conditions of his son's homestead site. She gave him 2 pages from her notebook with detailed notes on the installation sequence. He took everything with the focused attention of a student who has finally arrived at the right subject, and he left with the dignity of a man who has managed to ask for what he needed without making it smaller than it was. He completed the structure that fall, a modest bluff-back cabin for his son's marriage, the fourth such building in the region. Walt Beckett began declining in the summer of 1884, the gradual diminishment that follows decades of hard physical work in underground conditions, the cumulative cost of everything his body had given to stone and darkness in Pennsylvania. He did not make much of it. He was not a man who made much of things. He came to the cabin in October of that year, on a clear afternoon, riding his mule at the deliberate pace that had become slower over recent months, the pace of someone conserving what they had left. He sat inside for a long time with his back against the limestone wall and his eyes on the prairie framed in the cabin's single window, and the quality of his silence was different from the thinking silence Nora had come to know, quieter, more settled, with the particular restfulness of someone who has finished the work they came to do. He talked about the mines in Pennsylvania, which was unusual. He didn't usually speak about that period of his life with specificity. He described a shaft he had worked as a young man, the way the temperature had felt the first time he descended deep enough to feel the earth's constancy taking over from the surface's chaos. The moment of understanding that the ground was not hostile, that it had no position on the question of human survival, that it simply maintained its properties, and those properties were, if you understood them, available. I never thought then that understanding was something you could give to someone else, his voice carrying the unhurried quality of a man who has stopped managing time. I thought it was just a thing I happened to know. He looked at the limestone wall. You built what I only knew how to describe. Walt Beckett died in December of 1884 at 68 in his own small cabin at the edge of the settlement that he had built with the specific priorities of a man who understood cold from the inside out. Nora was with him at the end, having ridden over when Miles brought word that he had taken a serious turn. She sat beside him through the last hours the way she had sat with Thomas, but differently. This was not the shock of something taken. This was the completion of something that had run its full course. She gave the eulogy at his funeral standing in the settlement church for the first time in 4 years. She had thought carefully about what she wanted to say, which turned out to be less than she expected, because what Walt Beckett had given her did not reduce easily to eulogy language. She talked about the mines in Pennsylvania, not his mines, but what he had carried out of them, the understanding that the earth has properties, that those properties are learnable, that what the earth knows about temperature and time is available to anyone willing to pay the attention it requires. She said he had been the first person in this settlement to treat her ideas as physics rather than grief. Reverend Hale, sitting in the front pew, looked at his hands when she said that. The winter of 1885 came with the serious cold that alternated in this territory with the Mercy winters. Not as severe as 1882, but sustained 2 weeks of negative 25 to 30, the kind of cold that sorted cabins into those that could hold it and those that could not. 5 limestone integrated structures existed in the region by then Nora's original Miles's sandstone adaptation. Owen's build for his brother, the bluff-back cabin Harlan had raised for his son, and a 5th that a homesteader named Prentice had built the previous summer after consulting with Miles. She watched the 5 cabins hold through the 1885 cold, the way she watched everything that winter from her own warm space with the documents in front of her recording. The comparative data she accumulated across that season was the clearest record yet of the difference between the two approaches, the stone-backed structures burning consistently less wood while maintaining higher interior temperatures across the same external conditions. The pattern consistent across 5 separate buildings in 3 different geological substrates with 4 different builders. No one knocked on her door that winter asking for refuge. Not because the cold had spared them, but because the community had learned enough to prepare for it, better chinking on the old cabins, deeper wood reserves, doors oriented away from the wind. The clearest proof of her work was the crisis that did not arrive. She sent the compiled data to Dr. Pruitt. He incorporated it into a second paper more formal than the first, with tables of comparative measurements that made the case in the language that territorial planners read. The second paper generated direct correspondence, 2 letters from land office officials, 1 from a settlement organization working with homesteaders arriving from the east, all asking the same question: where were the suitable sites? What were the construction requirements? Who could advise on the specifics? The land office letter addressed her as Mrs. Nora Vass, Geological Construction Consultant, which was a title nobody had given her and which she read 3 times to be certain she was seeing it correctly. The territorial surveyor came in June of 1887, referred by Dr. Pruitt's published account which had generated the specific attention of people whose professional responsibility included knowing where settlers could safely build. He was a practical man named Aldrich Thoreau, with the careful empiricism of someone who made decisions that affected where families chose to stake their lives. He spent a full day at the cabin taking measurements, recording the formation's dimensions, documenting the construction details in the systematic shorthand of official record-keeping. Before he left, he asked Nora to help him map the other suitable limestone formations in the area sites she had scouted and assessed during her months of research. Locations she had described to Miles and Owen as starting points for their own projects. She rode with him for 3 days, covering the terrain northeast of the settlement, identifying formations, evaluating each against the criteria she had developed through building and living in her own structure. He recorded everything. She watched her knowledge become cartography, the accumulated understanding of grief converted into something that would persist in official records. He noted her name in the survey documentation as the primary source for geological assessment of construction sites in the northern sections. Not credited out of sentiment or compensation for loss. Credited because it was accurate. She was the person who knew. By then, Nora had been in the cabin 6 years, which meant the sod roof was fully established. The grass above indistinguishable from the surrounding prairie except for its shape. She had added a second room in 1886, extending into the deeper part of the alcove, accessible through an interior doorway. She had cut through the limestone's thinner section with the same iron chisels that had drilled the original anchor holes. The extension used the alcove's natural rock ceiling, required no constructed roof at all, maintained the most stable temperature of any space in the structure. Miles, 25 now and teaching construction methods to homesteaders arriving from the east, used it for his workshops. The boy who had carried logs without being asked, having become the man who carried the knowledge forward. The pages she'd torn from her notebook years ago, multiplied now into a curriculum he taught in her deepest room. She had 2 more sites to map for Aldrich before the survey party left at the end of the week. A letter to write to the land office about construction requirements in sandstone versus limestone, substrates a question from Miles about moisture management in his second room. These were the tasks of an ordinary week, the texture of a life that had work in it, again the accumulation of small responsibilities that meant a person had somewhere to stand. She set them in order in her mind the way she set everything in order, then put the work aside for the morning because there was a thing she did each spring that came before the work. She walked up the hill on a morning in late May when the grass had come back fully and the prairie was in the brief period of its best color. She carried her notebook not for any specific purpose, not to review or record, simply because it was the object that had been present for all of it. She sat on the hillside near Thomas's grave marker. Near lilies which she had carved herself the March after that winter, the letters cut into pine, with the same deliberateness she brought to everything. The cabin was visible from here, nestled against the limestone face, the sod roof green against the gray-white stone. Thin smoke from the morning fire, though the May air barely required it. The second room's ventilation fissure carried air up the face of the bluff in an invisible current she knew was there by having measured it. To the northeast, she could see the faint line of the creek, and though she could not see the structure itself from this distance, she knew approximately where Miles's cabin sat against its sandstone formation. Sound for 2 winters now, the builder already teaching others with the pages she had given him. The prairie spread south toward where the settlement's smoke rose in the morning air, fewer columns than there used to be on cold mornings, because the winters had been kind recently, but also because some of those cabins had been rebuilt with better knowledge. She had lived in this structure through 6 winters. She had burned less wood than any other household in the settlement in every one of those years. She had slept warm on every night of every one of those winters, including the nights when the temperature outside fell to ranges that her last winter in the log cabin had taught her were lethal inside wooden walls. She had not replaced a single structural element. The iron pins were as solid as the day the mortar cured the logs. Still sound the gap behind the back wall, still dry when she checked it. The stone had not changed. That was the thing about stone. It did not negotiate with time the way wood did not shrink or expand or develop the opinions that material develops under stress. It had been here before the cabin, before the settlement, before the country that claimed this territory. It would be here after all of those things in ways she could not see from where she sat. She had understood something it already knew, had built that understanding into a form that kept people alive. had watched that form replicate itself across a landscape that was still learning what it needed to survive. Lily had asked why they didn't live in the ground like bears. The question had been, the answer had always been the answer, waiting for someone to take it seriously, rather than set it aside as a child's simplicity. The bears had not been primitive in their understanding of earth and warmth. They had been accurate. Thomas's name on his marker was weathering at the edges, the carved letters softening with seasons. Lily's were still sharp pine held its cuts longer than you expected. She had been 7 years old with a question that nobody answered. Nora had spent 6 years making the answer. Not for any audience, not for vindication, not for the satisfaction of watching the people who had laughed revise their positions. Though all of that had happened in its own way, in the quiet sideways manner of communities absorbing corrections they couldn't bring themselves to announce. She had built it because a child had asked the right question and deserved the right answer. Because a man had gone out for wood in the dark and the cold and not come back. And the reason he hadn't come back was not the cold, but the structure's failure. And she was a woman who kept ledgers, who read patterns, who understood that failure, with this level of specificity, demanded a response with equivalent specificity. She had built the things she understood needed to be built the way you do the work that your particular understanding makes you responsible for. The sun moved. The smoke from the settlement's chimneys thinned as the morning warmed. Somewhere along the creek, a red-winged blackbird was making its case with the seasonal insistence of a creature for whom urgency was appropriate to the moment. In 11 cabins now scattered across the territory, built into stone by builders she had taught, or who had learned from those she taught, families would move through the coming winters without the particular fear that had emptied her own life on a January night. Thomas and Lily were not in those cabins. But the reason those cabins stood was, and Nora had come to understand, that this was the only kind of permanence grief could be converted into, not the dead returned, but the living kept in a form specific enough to mean something. She stood, brushed the grass from her coat, looked once more at the cabin against its limestone face, warm in the May light, the stone behind it, the same stone it had always been. The notebook went back into her coat pocket. She walked back down the hill and the cabin door opened onto warmth that the stone had been keeping since the morning fire. Steady, unhurried, with the geological patience of something that did not require acknowledgement to continue doing what it did. She sat at her table, opened to a fresh page, picked up her pencil. She began to write.